the chief learning officer or someone that manages a curriculum or someone even inside an organization that serves in that business support function where you're the learning solutions advocate for a line of business or inside trying to coach and advise them. It's never been more important for a learning leader to have a point of view about what it does take to actually get behavior to change. Now, the need to still be deeply connected to the business strategy hasn't changed, still there. But left to their own devices, it's not most business leaders' role to figure out the capacity of an organization to learn or the sequencing or what good learning really looks like. And people are overwhelmed. They're exhausted. There are just not enough hours in the day. So more than ever, becoming a really strong advocate and advisor, not just for a program, but to step over the program level and go to how do we get the associated behavior change for the business strategy that we are, trying to implement. That role has never been more important. I would also say having a point of view around technology, staying, you don't have to be deeply technical in any and every range, but you have to stay abreast. And then this extra domain that is not one that I had, frankly, in my wheelhouse even 10 years ago was a deeper understanding of neuroscience and just the cognitive capacity in the brain and how information flows and how learning works or doesn't. I think once you sort of get a sense of the neuroscience component, you can probably look back like I have over your career and go, oh, well, I probably shouldn't have done that, but it seemed like the best idea at the time. So net, I think it's the advisory function that's stronger than ever.
Interesting. And I share your horror in my case of some of the things that I worked on in all good faith to try and help people learn in the organizations where that was my job. And this is why I feel very strongly that we need to be much more science-based because time is so precious. And I think it's really incumbent on learning and development teams to build and maintain expertise on some of these fundamental things about how people do their best work.
And Chris, you probably heard Heidi mention this before, but you've probably sort of seen this in some of NLI's work in the marketplace. If you're around us for any period of time and you've ever seen, someone from NLI present, you will eventually bump into two slides that sort of tell the same storyline every time we are in the market. And that is there's a conventional wisdom side that all of us as be it learning or human capital practitioners have learned either through our suppliers or through our own experiences over the years, that there's a conventional wisdom that says, well, of course this is the right way to do something. And then every now and then you'll see us say, that's true, but what the science says about that is conventional wisdom isn't working for you. It's actually working against you. And it usually has something to do with recall. It has something to do with motivation and capacity and the biases that exist in our brain naturally. They're not bad. They're just there to keep us safe and protected. And how do we work around, how do we mitigate biases that exist that are just getting used in inappropriate ways? So that conventional wisdom versus science is a big deal.
Yeah, I think maybe as one of the learning professions, sort of one of the imperatives for us moving forward is to maybe adopt the policy of do no harm. And I'm not sure that that I can say that was true of me in the past. And sort of paying attention to the science, I think, is one way to try and avoid that. Can you talk a little bit about how the work of academics and brain scientists are impacting learning organizations today?
I can. Maybe what I can do is reference just a few ways that we've seen it come up. So I just mentioned one a moment ago, which was around bias. And I have learned, just even in the past 2 years, Chris, I've learned so much about how bias works in the brain, and that we love the phrase, if you have a brain then you likely have bias as well, too, because it is a natural mechanism learned over the evolution of the brain that's there to be a shortcut in decision making, to conserve energy in the brain, and to protect you from things that might cause you harm. And so it's a sort of a long evolutionary form of pattern recognition. And then what happens is we take these very old archetypes that are buried deep in our brain, and the bias, the triggers for enacting those, and we end up using them in inaccurate places. So let's take bias in decision making. So we now, instead of going in and talking about unconscious bias training, which I would wager the learning profession has probably invested as much in unconscious bias training in the last 20 years as it has in just about any other subject area, yet we still today are having conversations in every firm about how to be more diverse, how to be more inclusive, how to allow everyone's voice, into the mix. So what we've learned from the science side is stop talking about sort of this somewhat elusive, ethereal desire to be inclusive, but instead back up and talk about what's happening in the brain and the different type of biases. There's actually over 150 different individual documented biases that exist naturally in the brain. And so there's strategies to recognize those, to label them, to call them out, and to handle them. So biases like similarity bias or expedience bias or safety bias, these are all things that show up for us day in and day out. That's one example. Feedback, such another robust area to talk about. I would say every program that, as you and I went through our formative years as business professionals, we were taught, how to give feedback. The emphasis was always on giving feedback, giving feedback, giving feedback. Well, it turns out it's a more favorable cognitive state to teach people how to ask for feedback, as opposed to teaching people how to give feedback. And so the asking of feedback actually reduces a threat state in the brain for both the giver of the feedback as well as the receiver of the feedback, and creates a much more frictionless exchange in between individuals. That's a second. And then a third, and I'll pause on that one, is in leadership. So I can imagine this is true in sales training as well, but we as learning professionals have been brilliant at creating competency models. With every domain and every sub-behavior across multiple levels and career paths in an organization, and you end up having all of that, which does on some level help with instructional design. I get that. It sort of focuses you on the right behaviors to pursue. But when it comes to the individual consuming competency models, it's virtually impossible. The cognitive load is way too much. And so what we're seeing now as the pattern in leadership development is to boil things down to a few essential principles. Microsoft did this beautifully, but to boil things down to the essence of the most important things to focus on. And then what the brain does is, it's a bit like drafting and, bike riding. The brain then starts to connect things that are related through neural pathways without you actually even asking the brain to do it. It does it on a non-conscious level. So if you can focus the brain on the most important things, then quietly behind the scenes, it's helping you by figuring out what are the related things in your life and the patterns that the brain has seen you engage in that need to be activated whenever you talk about those essential areas. So just the level of focus has changed tremendously.
In that case, you're sort of like hijacking the the bias mechanisms and the propensity to sort of recognize repeated patterns in order to in order to get the behavior outcomes that you want to get.
Yeah. And you know what? The smarter we get in our own way, sometimes, to be honest. I mean, so whether, we've gotten our master's degrees or doctoral degrees in instructional design or adult learning theory, and we fall in love with ourselves. Without meaning to do any harm, where our intentions are actually quite the opposite, very, very positive. And the more complicated we make things, the more layers we put into them, the more complex the structures are that we create already inside of a very complicated business world and complicated personal lives that we all have as well too. We're not helping our learners. We're making it worse. So we're almost having to drive the opposite direction, which is a reductionist view. I say this to clients all the time. If you ever, and this is usually pretty early in an engagement, I would say, if you ever find yourself getting irritated with me as a consultant helping you or NLI, it's because we're probably pushing you to say it in fewer words, to do less, to focus on fewer things, to reduce the cognitive load to the point that the most important things become quite sticky and recallable. Because our fundamental belief is if you can't recall it, the likelihood that you will do it goes down pretty substantially.
I've spent time this year, I've had time this year to look at science and to talk to scientists and look at some of the research that goes on. It's its own world. It's very dense. Academics are usually working on very, very kind of small problems, and they iterate many times. Of course, people are starting to use the word science like it's a sort of panacea for everything, and it too is always changing. It's constantly sort of innovating. So if you're not in the world of science, or you're not in the world of academia, you're in business and you're trying to deliver results, it's almost impossible to keep up and stay in touch. And it's also very easy to be bamboozled. And I'm seeing examples of this from, many, many companies who sort of claim to have, brain science, some fundamental brain science kind of underlying their product or service as a way to legitimize it. I've heard it called neurobling, which is a sort of humorous way of sort of referencing that. And I'm absolutely not suggesting that NLI is doing that at all. But I am interested in the work that NLI is doing because it sort of helps codify that science and put it into frameworks that you can use and that you can deploy. And we mentioned this sort of earlier. One example might be the work from, I think it's Leela Devachi at Columbia. On this AGES model. If people are not familiar with it, it might be useful for you to describe what that is as an example of this technique of taking science and making it applicable in the workplace.
Yeah, delighted to, and it's quite, AGES is quite specific to learning. So I'm glad you chose that one. There are a couple of others that your listeners may have heard about from NLI. SCARF is an acronym for a model around motivation, and SEEDS is an acronym for a model around bias. But AGES is specifically about learning. And it's, as it sounds, AGES, and it's an acronym that stands for attention, generation, emotion, and spacing. And this squarely falls into one of those categories, Chris, of if I'd only known then what I know now, I might have designed and delivered, learning differently. And even as a parent, I find myself using AGES when I talk to my teenage children about how they're studying in school or how they're preparing for a test in particular. But what AGES is about is Lila did some work on figuring out what causes things to to encode, what causes information to encode from short term to long term, and how it, how memory is affected by how we approach learning. So what attention is about